The news of war was generally met with great enthusiasm in August of 1914. It had been 99 years since Europe had experienced a continental-wide war. Many had thought another war would never occur. The opportunity for young men to demonstrate heroism and valor had passed. They had missed out. But with the outbreak of a new war, Germans, Austrians, Italians, French, British, and Russians rushed to enlistment stations to quickly sign up and join their nation's armed forces. They didn't want to be late and miss what they believed to be the only time in their lifetime that they would be able to demonstrate battlefield heroism. Many in the fall of 1914 spoke of a quick war, a war that would be over by Christmas, a war they were so confident of winning that perhaps the opposing side would quickly run away and surrender before any real fighting occurred. Wives and girlfriends urged their sweethearts to quickly join up. No woman wanted to be acquainted with a shirker or a dodger of their duty. For those who were not married or had no girlfriend, acquiring a sharp-looking uniform and performing military service provided an opportunity to impress young ladies and win the hearts of fellow countrymen. Although Russia was politically, economically, and militarily unprepared to go to war in 1914, the Tsar was able to quickly pull together an army of several million that was expected to quickly rout its German, Austrian, and Ottoman foes. Despite simmering hatred of the Tsar and bitterness over living conditions, millions of Russian peasants were inducted into the armed forces and sent to the front. Many of them could not read or write, and thus historians know less about their experiences during the war. Despite all the lingering sources of bitterness that would prevent Russia from remaining in the war until the end, millions still believed in fighting for the motherland and fighting for the Tsar, that Russia at least did not have to worry about manpower shortages at the commencement of hostilities. On the evening of August 4th, 1914, a large crowd stood outside of Buckingham Palace in London and cheered at the appearance of King George V and other members of the royal family. Britons went to war with enormous optimism, confident that the strength of their empire and their alliances with France and Russia would lead to a quick rout of German forces. For over 100 years, the Royal Navy had dominated the world's oceans, and many Britons believed their naval superiority would once again be the deciding factor in this new conflict. Britain's war secretary was one of the few who did not believe the war would be over quickly or won easily, and that Britain needed to prepare for a protracted struggle. Field Marshal Horatio H. Kitchener had a distinguished service record commanding British forces in the Sudan, the Cape Colony, India, and Egypt. He was already a national hero when he became war secretary. He predicted a war that would last at least 3 years and result in a massive number of casualties. He was one of the few that foresaw the death and destruction that the First World War would inevitably bring. Stating his belief that the war would, quote, plumb the depths of manpower to the last million, unquote, Kitchener called for a massive recruitment program that would raise a massive new British army in the millions. This famous image of Lord Kitchener on a recruitment poster endeavoring to recruit volunteers has become one of the most iconic images of the war and would become an often copied image for recruitment in other nations, including the United States. The stern face of Kitchener seemed to look directly at the young viewer and inspired many young Britons in their patriotism to volunteer for army service. Kitchener hoped for 100,000 young men to volunteer to serve in the British Army, but the response far exceeded Kitchener's expectations. In just 8 weeks, approximately 400,000 young British men volunteered for service. The young and green volunteers would become known as Kitchener's Army. Although launched with a great deal of patriotism and bravado, in time Kitchener's army would face the horrors of the Western Front, and often proved to be unprepared and inadequately trained for the new industrialized warfare. The British public would become shocked at the appalling casualties suffered by Kitchener's volunteers at the front in the next few years. A particular feature of the new recruitment drive of Kitchener was the so-called PALs and Chums battalions. These were units of volunteers that were from the same town or locality. Volunteers were essentially promised that if they joined up, they would be able to serve with their family members and neighbors, other men around whom they had grown up from their area of Britain. London stockbrokers formed a battalion known as the Stockbrokers Battalion. Young men of Liverpool formed several battalions from their city. The city of Manchester raised 4 battalions in August and 4 more in November of 1914. Volunteers from Preston, England formed the Preston Pals. Former schoolboys from a school in Grimsby became the Grimsby Chums. Football clubs formed their own battalions. Almost 100 battalions formed in the first 2 years of the war were PALs or Chums battalions, which drastically swelled the ranks of the regular British Army. Locally raised units often created some unexpected dynamics during conflict on the front. Men that had legitimate health complications that should have been exempted from the front were more likely to lie or cover up their condition so that they would not have to endure the stigma of staying behind while the rest of the village or club went to war. Younger men lied about their age so as not to be left behind. Amidst combat at the front, when men were scared and contemplated not following orders or attacking a fortified position, they often did it anyway. Serving with others who knew them from home was a powerful inducement to demonstrate courage, even blind courage, in battle so that a reputation of cowardice or failure would not follow them all the way back home when and if they returned with their pals. Thus, casualty rates could often be higher among the PALs battalions due to inadequate training or blind loyalty to the peer pressure of the group. Many PALs battalions were subsequently abandoned or amalgamated after suffering heavy casualties, and devastated units were scattered amongst other units. The high casualty rate among so many young men from the same club or village could have devastating effects on their hometowns. Some towns lost an appalling number of its young men and never recovered from the grief and loss. The devastating horrors of war, however, were far from the minds of the optimistic men who comprised Kitchener's army in the fall of 1914. Many of them believed this was their last chance for military glory, and they would never live it down if they missed out on their opportunity. They thought it would be a great adventure, an extended trip as a Boy Scout. Believing the conflict might only last 6 months, they were in a rush to get into the fighting at the front. Towns, villages, communes, and cities all over Europe excitedly waved goodbye to their young men as they marched off to war, with few realizing that many of them would never be seen again. Others were quick to enlist for more nationalistic reasons. They held a firm belief in the glory of their nation and sought to prove it on the battlefield. One such young Austrian was Adolf Hitler. He rejoiced at the news that Germany was at war and believed the moment for his nation and his own moment had arrived. It is possible that he is depicted in this photo of the Odeonsplatz in Munich when news of Germany's war was announced. But it is probably more likely that this photo is a fabrication and the jubilant face of Hitler was artificially inserted into the photo by Hitler's future personal photographer. This photo was widely circulated in Nazi Germany to extol Hitler's long-standing belief in the German nation, but it's difficult to believe it is not a forgery. What was not false was Hitler's enthusiasm for war and that he did serve in the Bavarian army as an Austrian. He enlisted as a 25-year-old and was assigned to the Bavarian Reserve Regiment 16. His experience during the war would shape and mold his politics for the decades to come. Although the multiple nationalities that coexisted uneasily within the Austro-Hungarian Empire were not necessarily eager to go to war to defend the Habsburg dynasty, the empire did experience a moment of unity as the war began. The Habsburg monarchy was intentional to cast the war as vengeance for the slain Archduke and a moment for imperial triumph. Uneasily, the diverse ethnic groups went off to war, but their enthusiasm and support for the conflict would remain tenuous throughout the conflict and completely dissipate when Austria was on the verge of defeat. Likewise, the restless internal groups of the Ottoman Empire also reluctantly supported the Ottoman war effort. The Sultan had been relegated to the sidelines before the war began, and now a faction of the Young Turks acted as military dictators, pulling the empire into the broader war. The Ottoman leadership hoped that joining the war on the side that opposed its traditional enemy of Russia could improve its position and help to rescue the empire from further decline. Because the central powers of Imperial Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire were centrally located on the continent of Europe and surrounded by the allied nations of Russia, France, and Britain, the First World War was conducted on two fronts: a western front with Germany fighting Belgium, France, and Britain, and an eastern front in which Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire fighting Imperial Russia. In May of 1915, Italy would switch sides and join the Allies by declaring war against Austria-Hungary. German war planners were convinced that the only means they had to win the war was to knock France out early and then turn its attention to the east and defeat Russia. The plan for winning Germany's two-front war was crafted several years before the actual outbreak of war by the chairman of the German Great General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen. Von Schlieffen came from an established Prussian military family and gradually worked his way up through the officer corps during 53 years of military service. He commanded troops during the Franco-Prussian War, but his brilliance was as a strategist, and he set his mind to tackle the fundamental strategic dilemma Germany faced in the early 20th century with its two enemies, France and Russia, standing in alliance and surrounding Germany. Although von Schlieffen was a master of the counteroffensive, he envisioned as early as 1905 a strategic offensive that would quickly knock out France, so that Germany would only have to fight on one front, to the east against Russia, and thus improve Germany's odds for winning the next war. The strategic offensive that came to be called the Schlieffen Plan proposed that Germany not directly attack and fight France on the usual battlegrounds of Alsace-Lorraine and the Ardennes forests, but rather bypass this difficult terrain in all its rivers and rather outflank the French, moving around the French left flank by invading France through Belgium. By moving quickly through Belgium, despite its neutrality, Germany would be able to surprise the French, who would be expecting the usual direct route, move quickly through the flatter ground of Belgium and northern France, and then turn south with a strong right hook, envelop Paris, demand its surrender, and have France surrender quickly so that Germany could then turn its attention to the east and fight Russia. Time was of the essence. Schlieffen was insistent that, in order for the plan to work, the German army must move quickly, take the French by surprise, and secure the surrender of Paris within the first 6 weeks of the war. If the German army did not move quickly, and instead got bogged down outside of France, then the British would have time to cross the English Channel in force and further obstruct the German march, and, more ominously, if Germany delayed, then Russia would have time to mobilize and move its large numbers and force Germany to fight on two fronts, the west and the east. To his dying day, von Schlieffen continued to revive his plan. He planned, wrote, and lectured extensively to German military planners and continued to emphasize the 6-week timetable and the absolute necessity of keeping the right hook strong with nearly 30 divisions of troops moving around the north. Succeeding von Schlieffen upon his retirement in 1906 was Helmuth von Moltke, known as the Younger, to distinguish him from his father, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the hero of the German Wars of Unification and the conqueror of France and Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. In some ways, Moltke the Younger lived in the shadow of his father, Moltke the Elder. Whereas the father was determined, decisive, and a visionary, the Younger was more resigned to events, could be self-doubting, and more of an introvert. The Schlieffen Plan he inherited required risk, boldness, and striking hard and fast. Although Moltke believed in the plan and worked to improve it upon his appointment as chief of the Great General Staff, as the campaign unfolded, Moltke began to question the plan's wisdom and in the end undermined and diluted the plan. Moltke continued to worry that the right hook of the plan would be dangerously exposed. He also continued to worry that Russia with all its might would strike faster than expected in the east and overrun Germany while it was preoccupied in the west. Thus, even before the Schlieffen Plan was executed, Moltke already started moving tens of thousands of troops from the west to the east. The basic theory of the plan was therefore compromised even before it started. Historians continue to debate today whether or not Moltke's relocation of troops away from the west to the east was the single greatest factor in Germany's eventual failure in the west. Moltke remained at his headquarters in Luxembourg throughout the opening weeks of the war. He issued general directives by way of emissaries from his headquarters, but he gave his army commanders wide latitude in their operations. The stress and eventual failure to capture Paris quickly would compromise Moltke's already failing health and lead to his dismissal before the end of 1914. Germany commenced its invasion of Western Europe on August 2, 1914, by violating the territorial sovereignty of Luxembourg. Luxembourg had gained its independence in the previous century, and as a small state was doomed to be caught between any conflict between Germany and France. German troops first appeared in Luxembourg at the Trois-Vierges train station on their way to France. German troops began moving through southeastern Luxembourg the next day, crossing the Moselle River and headed towards the capital of Luxembourg City. As tens of thousands of German troops poured into Luxembourg, the Grand Duchess ordered her tiny defense force of 400 soldiers not to resist the invaders. German troops continued to move west towards France. Luxembourg would remain occupied by the Germans for the rest of the war, a foreshadowing of experience once again during the Second World War. In compliance with the Schlieffen Plan, German troops moved towards Belgium on its way to France. The German government contacted Albert I, the King of the Belgians, and demanded the right to safely traverse Belgium on its way to France. King Albert refused. Even though he knew Belgium and its army was vastly outnumbered and would be quickly overwhelmed by German forces, Albert abhorred the idea of letting an aggressor nation treat his kingdom as a doormat on its way to invading someone else. He refused German overtures to march through Belgium and called on his nation to resist the invader. Albert's heroic defiance would earn him the everlasting gratitude of his nation and earn him the moniker of the Soldier King. Using Belgium as a speedier highway on its way to France, the German army now poured across the border, keeping its right hook of the Schlieffen Plan strong as conceived. 3 large German armies poured over the Belgian border. To the north was the First Army under the command of the aggressive Alexander von Kluck. In the center marched Germany's Second Army under the command of the more cautious Karl von Bülow. To the south was the Third Army, under orders from Max von Hausen. Each army was composed of several divisions of troops, with the First Army, in compliance with the Schlieffen Plan, containing the most divisions. Von Kluck's outer army was commanded to hook around the north quickly through Belgium and then move into France and descend on Paris from the north and west. The invading German army was so massive that the Belgian forces that endeavored to stop it were quickly demolished. The first great obstacles the German army faced in its invasion of Belgium were the 2 fortified cities of Liège and Namur. Both were located on the river Meuse, and both had been reinforced in previous years as fortress cities to block any invader coming from the east. The city of Liège lies in the valley of the Meuse River and is situated at the confluence of the Ourthe and Meuse rivers in Belgium's southern region of Wallonia. For centuries, Liège was always a critical point for marching armies due to its location at the intersection of the 2 rivers and its high ground on the western portion of the city. For centuries, a castle dominated the high ground above the town, and then, in the 19th century, a series of 12 forts were constructed as a defense in depth to bulwark the city, hopefully to make it impassable. The 12 forts varied from each other, but many of them were positioned below ground or into the side or top of the surrounding high ground. Large gun mounts and smaller firing positions characterized each fort. The fortifications of Liège followed conventional military thinking that a fortified location could block an opposing army and not be easily overcome. Medieval and early modern armies always approached fortified cities like Liège with a great deal of trepidation, recognizing the formidable obstacles would not be easily overcome. Deeply dug barracks and troop quarters also provided an extended store of food and ammunition, enabling the fort defenders to hold out for an extended period of time against a besieging force. In 1914, Liège was one of the most entrenched and strongly defended cities on earth. What the fortresses of Liège failed to account for, however, was modern weaponry and industrialized firepower. Bows, arrows, spears, small cannons, and hand weapons stood little chance against an entrenched city such as Liège, but air power and modern siege cannons were a complete game changer. Rather than going around the city of Liège, which would have slowed down the German army and taken them off the strict timetable of 6 weeks to Paris, which the Schlieffen Plan required, to stay on schedule, the Germans demanded the quick surrender of Liège. When they were refused, Zeppelin airships flew over Liège and dropped bombs, killing 9 civilians. This was the first ever air attack against a European city in history. The Liège fort still held out, forcing the Germans to pause their advance and lay siege to the city, demanding its surrender. Pressed for time and determined to pulverize the obstructing forts, the Germans brought forward several of the largest artillery pieces ever fielded in warfare. The 42-centimeter field howitzer was a large siege cannon designed to blast away fortified positions. A single blast can rip apart concrete and entire hillsides. Although the Liège forts were constructed with concrete, the forts were not constructed with such large artillery pieces in mind. German spotters moved forward and called back the range to the guns several miles back from Liège, and then walked up each successive round until they struck the positions of the Liège forts. Each fort the howitzers targeted crumbled by the force of each shell blast. The guns of the forts fell silent. The Belgian defenders suffered heavy casualties, and soon the ring of fortresses were neutralized and no longer obstructed the German advance. Once the Germans snuck into the city of Liège, they forced the city's surrender. The guns of the forts could not aim toward the city, and thus the forts as well were forced to capitulate. The siege of Liège lasted for 11 days. This was 9 days longer than the German army wanted to be tied up in eastern Belgium, and longer than the Schlieffen Plan's timetable would allow. The delay would prove costly once the German army entered France. The legacy of the Battle of Liège was that conventional military wisdom regarding the defensibility of entrenched fortresses was shattered by the strength of modern firepower. Henceforth, the strength of a mobile army's firepower would seem to be more decisive than the strength of one's fortifications. King Albert's defiance was heroic, but the Belgians faced impossible odds. Despite a valiant effort, the Belgian army under King Albert was utterly unable to stop the German onslaught. Recognizing the British and the French would have a better shot at defeating the Germans, King Albert withdrew his troops to the city of Antwerp and its fortifications. He hoped to harass the Germans from behind, even as the British and French fought them at the front. The Belgian forces were an unwelcome distraction for the Germans behind their lines, and the Belgians did what they could to hold up the Germans, but the Belgians were simply overmatched. The garrison of the Belgians at Antwerp were forced to surrender to the Germans after holding out as long as possible. The advancing Germans faced a somewhat similar obstacle in their march across Belgium at the city of Namur. Namur, just like Liège, is located on the Meuse River, and for hundreds of years was a strategic town along the river with strategic high ground. Namur was also surrounded by strong forts and defensive works based on a similar design as Liège. Using tactics perfected at Liège, the siege of the forts at Namur only lasted 2 days before the garrison capitulated to the Germans. The guns used against Liège and Namur were larger than any naval gun in history and made short work of the defensive forts. The victories of the Germans at Liège and Namur convinced the Germans that entrenched fortifications could be overcome by bombardment. That confidence would, however, be proven misplaced during the Battle of Verdun 2 years later. Frustrated by the holdups at Liège and Namur, German commanders were determined to not let the Belgians further impede their progress or throw them further off their timetable. It is probably due to this frustration that the German army became increasingly aggressive in their march across Belgium and proceeded to commit a series of atrocities and mass executions that so enraged the world that the invasion became known as the Rape of Belgium. Because Imperial Germany had casually disregarded the sovereignty and neutrality of Belgium, which had been guaranteed by the 1839 Treaty of London, which the German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann callously dismissed as a, quote, scrap of paper, unquote, the civilian population of Belgium was likely held in little regard and was targeted for regular destruction. Belgian civilians were the targets of atrocities, and property was intentionally destroyed. German soldiers murdered over 6,000 Belgian civilians during its invasion, and an additional 17,000 Belgians perished due to imprisonment, malnourishment, deportation, or additional death sentences. A further 3,000 Belgians were killed attempting to cross the so-called Wire of Death. The neighboring Netherlands remained neutral during the First World War, and Belgians seeking to flee the German army would cross the border endeavoring to escape. To prevent a mass Belgian migration to the Netherlands, the German army constructed an electric fence that spanned the Belgian-Dutch border of 125 miles. Belgians who touched the wire were electrocuted to death by 2,000 volts. Others who tried to get through the wire by other means were shot by German sentries. Thus, Belgians remained subject to murder, rape, pillage, and death in their own country with no ability to escape. One of the worst episodes of German atrocities occurred in the Belgian city of Dinant. In what became known as the Sack of Dinant, German troops disarmed the residents of the city and commanded them to not resist the German occupation. Convinced, however, that guerrilla fighters were picking off German troops, German officers ordered the destruction of Dinant and the execution of its citizens. Approximately 674 citizens of Dinant were intentionally murdered by German troops, including men, women, and children. About 2/3 of Dinant's buildings were razed. The sack of Dinant particularly enraged world opinion and earned the German army a barbaric reputation among the Allied nations and among the neutral states, such as the United States. The German government officially denied the atrocities at Dinant for decades. It was not until 2001 that the German government officially apologized to the city and the descendants of the victims. Other Belgian towns suffered a similar fate as Dinant, with looting, destruction, and murder. At Aarschot, 156 were murdered. At Andenne, 211 were murdered. At Tamins, 383 were murdered. Rape was commonplace during the German invasion of Belgium as well, but often underreported or not reported. Belgian women were repeatedly raped in and around the town of Aarschot in late August and early September. Some of the German army's greatest destruction took place at the Belgian city of Louvain. Located 25 miles east of Brussels, Louvain was a historic university town that boasted the largest university in the Low Countries. On August 19th, German troops entered the town and established a headquarters for the German First Army. About 15,000 soldiers occupied the town. Probably responding to false reports of imminent attack, German troops began shooting civilians, setting homes on fire, and torturing residents. On August 25th at 11:30 p.m., German troops entered the library of the Catholic University of Louvain and set fire to the 14th century structure. As the fire burned for the next 10 hours, priceless and irreplaceable medieval manuscripts and book collections were completely destroyed. More than 230,000 books were lost in the blaze, including 750 medieval manuscripts. Personal libraries and collections were also lost. In the following days, the rest of Louvain was pillaged and ransacked, with soldiers taking money, wine, silver, and other valuable objects. Belgians who protested were shot. Altogether, some 1,100 buildings were destroyed in Louvain. 248 residents were killed, and most of the city's 42,000 residents were sent into the countryside for exile. German destruction and atrocities in Belgium outraged a multitude of nations. The reputation of the German army was permanently damaged, even though the Allies at times embellished the actual events that occurred. Italy, who entered the war on the side of Germany, now started moving even more towards the Allies, seeking to distance themselves from the reputation the Germans had earned in Belgium. Reaction was equally harsh in the United States, and outrage was often directed against German Americans regarding crimes for which they had no complicity. The rape of Belgium would also be further inducement for the United States to join the war on the side of the Allies and not on the side of the Germans a little over 2 years later. Upon the German invasion of Belgium on their way to France, the French military implemented its previous established plan known as Plan 17. French strategists had approved Plan 17 in May of 1913 to be implemented in the event of a war with Germany. It envisioned an all-out counteroffensive to meet a German attack. The French plan assumed Belgium would remain neutral in a future conflict, and Germany would uphold its pledge to preserve Belgian neutrality. The French plan also assumed that any conflict between France and Germany would primarily occur where it had always occurred, in and around the mutual border they shared, somewhere around the Alsace and Lorraine regions. The French believed that a quick all-out strike in the rural region would put Germany on its heels before it could mount a massive invasion of France and threaten Paris. The hope was that Plan 17 would result in a quick French victory, particularly with Germany forced to fight on two fronts with Russia to its east, and then France would be able to regain what it had lost at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Alsace and Lorraine territories. Commander-in-Chief of French forces at the outbreak of World War I was General Joseph Joffre. Although extensively trained and a career officer who had seen combat during the Franco-Prussian War and siege of Paris, Joffre had never commanded troops in battle. Joffre was an engaged and active commander who refused to sit idle far behind his lines. But he did insist on sitting down for an extended lunch and adamantly defended his right to getting a solid 8 hours of sleep every night. He was a firm believer in the so-called cult of the offensive, that battles are won by the side with greater courage, élan, or spirit, which he considered secondary to weapons and firepower. His answer was to always attack on every occasion and in any way. Little thought was put into the value of strategic withdrawals and regrouping to fight another day. Joffre, however, made a series of errant and potentially disastrous decisions for the French army at the beginning of the war. He refused to believe intelligence reports that contradicted his opinions and plans. Many felt that if his generals disagreed with him, then they were subsequently fired. Joffre blindly held to Plan 17 and launched repeated offensive against the Germans through Alsace-Lorraine. Despite warnings from his subordinate General Charles Lanrezac, Joffre refused to believe that the main thrust of the German invasion was coming through Belgium. He continued to believe he was engaged with the main body of German troops on the frontiers of France, when in reality German divisions were drawing French troops in and allowing them to advance to distract them from the main German thrust to the north. Once the French were drawn in, then German forces brought their full strength to bear and powerfully drove back the French forces from the French frontiers. Participating in the fierce fighting on the frontiers of France and in the early weeks of the war was a young platoon commander in the 33rd Regiment named Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was involved in the French effort to take back Dinant from the Germans, but with others he was forced to retreat across the bridge spanning the River Meuse. While he attempted to withdraw, de Gaulle was shot in the knee and wounded on the bridge. De Gaulle was hospitalized and started lamenting the poor resources and commanders in the French army. De Gaulle would serve with distinction during the coming years of the war, before being taken prisoner, but he would make a much larger name for himself during the Second World War as the presumptuous commander of the Free French forces. The French army in the Battle of the Frontiers was slow to grasp how dangerous their position was increasingly becoming. With Joffre ignoring reports that the main bulk of the German army was moving past them to the north, the situation of the French was made more precarious by its outdated bayonet charges, colorful uniforms that failed to disguise its members, and remaining extended far too deep into German lines, making the possibility of German encirclement an increased likelihood. At Charleroi, west of Namur, the French had planned to launch an offensive to beat back the German advance in Belgium, but the Germans struck first. The Germans moved so quickly and forcibly that they got behind the French right flank and threatened to surround them. The Battle of Charleroi featured troops from France's overseas possessions, including Algerians, Tunisians, and Senegalese, who fought vigorously to prevent an encirclement. Only timely French reinforcements from the south prevented the French at Charleroi from being encircled and wiped out. The French suffered as many as 10,000 casualties fighting in and around Charleroi, and then vigorously retreated west before the advancing Germans. Awaiting the advancing German army in western Belgium was the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. The BEF was one of the best armies in the world, no doubt the most experienced. It had been seasoned by conflict defending the British Empire. It had been developed into a skilled and mobile fighting force during the Boer War in the Cape Colony of South Africa. The BEF was well equipped and could lay down a line of devastating, accurate gunfire with their Lee Enfield rifles. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, the BEF began embarking to France on August 9th. The BEF, comprised of only 80,000 men, was about to encounter the advancing German First Army, comprised of several 100,000 soldiers. The BEF was stationed on the northernmost point of the front and was charged with blocking the further advance of the outermost hook of the Schlieffen Plan. The BEF arrived in Mons, Belgium, on August 22nd, and immediately began fortifying their position and digging trenches. A key component of the BEF at Mons were the Royal Fusiliers. The British Expeditionary Force was under the command of Field Marshal Sir John French. French was a competent soldier, an experienced commander, and a national hero after several tours of duty in Africa. While the French forces to the south of his BEF at Mons were seeking his help, French refused and insisted he use the BEF to stop the advance of the Germans along the Mons-Condé Canal. French would remain in command of the BEF for the first year and a half of the war, but disagreements with his superiors and failure to win the war led to his forced resignation in 1915. After overwhelming the fortified cities of Liège and Namur and isolating the King's Belgian forces around Antwerp, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies continued to march west towards France. The French 5th Army decided to take a stand near the Belgian city of Charleroi. The British Expeditionary Force dug in near the Belgian city of Mons and waiting on the approaching Germans. The French, however, were driven back at Charleroi, and now it was contingent on the British to slow the German advance at Mons. Small scouting and reconnaissance parties were sent forward from the British lines at Mons. First contact with the Germans was made on August 21st. Private John Parr of the 4th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment became the first British soldier killed in the war, perishing in an exchange of rifle fire with German scouts. Parr had lied about his age to join the British Army. He claimed to be 18 when he was actually only 15. He was killed outside of Mons at only 17 years of age. He is buried today in the nearby St. Symphorien military cemetery. Large numbers of the German First Army now moved towards Mons the next day as the British waited on the far side of the canal. The Battle of Mons would commence with intensity the very next day on August 23rd. Much of the Battle of Mons centered around a key bridge spanning the canal between Mons and Nîmes. The Nîmes Bridge was still intact and would provide the fastest and easiest means for the Germans to cross from Nîmes into Mons. The British quickly recognized the strategic value of the position and were determined to hold the position at all costs. The bridge would also serve the purpose of bottlenecking the far more numerous German forces and thus reducing their manpower advantage for the benefit of the much smaller BEF. The Battle of Mons commenced on August 23rd at dawn, with an artillery barrage against the British lines across the canal. The Germans were determined to take the 4 bridges that crossed the canal, particularly the Nîmes Bridge. At 9 a.m., the German infantry assault commenced. 4 battalions attacked, particularly the Nîmes Bridge, and endeavored to force their way across. The German battalions advanced parade ground formation, often shoulder to shoulder, closely packed together. The BEF poured concentrated rifle and machine gun fire into the German lines. It was almost impossible to miss, and German soldiers fell by the hundreds. The Germans abandoned their closely formed lines and spread out, making them more difficult to be hit from across the canal. Slowly and methodically, the British lines were reduced, and German troops began to make their way across the bridges. Only the heroic actions of particularly 2 machine gun positions slowed their advance. Maurice Dees was an Irish soldier who had attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, England. He served as a 24-year-old lieutenant in the 4th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. As the BEF was becoming overwhelmed across the canal, Dees ran back and forth, exposing himself to enemy fire, but endeavored to keep the guns in action and his men continuously firing. As more and more machine gunners were taken out, Dees himself kept a gun in action and continuously fired into the German lines. He was struck repeatedly and continued to fire. After being struck 4 or 5 times, he at last collapsed and died from his injuries. His heroic actions delayed the German advance and gave more time for the British to withdraw without being overwhelmed. Dees was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British Army honor for those who have demonstrated extraordinary valor. Dees is buried in the St. Symphorien Military Cemetery near Mons. After Lieutenant Dees was mortally wounded, remaining BEF forces were in danger of being overrun at Nîmes Bridge. Quickly recognizing the danger, Private Sidney Godley stepped into action. Godley had grown up poor and had joined the Royal Fusiliers in 1909. Godley now volunteered to cover the retreat and brought a machine gun back into action against the approaching Germans. Despite withering fire being aimed directly at him, Godley continued to fire and hold his position for the next 2 hours. Repeated German assaults against the bridge were beaten back. Godley continued to fire despite being wounded in the head by a bullet and wounded in the back by a nearby exploding shell. Godley finally ran out of ammunition. Before he collapsed from exhaustion, however, Godley still had the presence of mind to disassemble his machine gun and throw its component parts into the canal, rendering it useless to the Germans. He was taken prisoner by the Germans, had his wounds treated, and survived the war. Godley, just like Dees, was awarded the Victoria Cross for valor and outstanding courage. Today, the heroic sacrifices of Dees and Godley are commemorated by a plaque beneath the Nîmes Bridge, where the 2 men made their heroic stand. Additional efforts were also made during the course of the battle to detonate the bridges that crossed the canal. Lance Corporal Charles Jarvis, Royal Engineers, a member of the 57th Field Company, achieved the destruction of the bridge at Chums, and thus slowed the German advance, forcing them to find alternate crossing points. Jarvis received the Victoria Cross for his bravery amidst the fighting. Despite the dogged stand the BEF put forth at Mons and the canal, the assaulting German force was simply too great to stop entirely. German forces overran the bridge at Nîmes. Other Germans crossed the canal to the west of the British, and others crossed in force to their south. With the threat of encirclement and being wiped out a very real danger, the British commenced a general withdrawal southwest from Mons into France. Units stayed back in villages to cover the retreat as the BEF began a prolonged retreat from Mons. Almost the entirety of Belgium would remain occupied for the remainder of the war. Belgian citizens often suffered horrible food shortages for the next 4 years, as the majority of foodstuffs were confiscated by the occupying Germans for use by the German army. Those that resisted the Germans suffered quick and severe reprisals. The region of Flanders to the northwest became one of the most destructive battlefields in Europe. The Germans kept coming and coming, pouring out of Belgium and into France, endeavoring to meet the Schlieffen Plan's deadline of 6 weeks to capture Paris. The British and French conducted a systematic withdrawal in what became known as the Great Retreat. The British particularly covered 10, 15, and 20 miles each day for a straight 2 weeks, slowing down the Germans but also staying ahead of them. The more the Germans moved into France, the more extended their supply lines became, and the more exhausted their frontline troops became. Day after day, the British and French continued to fall back and surrender more and more land to the oncoming Germans. The withdrawing troops began to complain and question how long they would have to continue their retreat, and when would they stand and fight. As they crossed rivers such as the Sambre, the Meuse, the Oise, the Aisne, the Ourcq, and the Marne, the Allies blew bridges, harassed the invaders, blocked roads, ambushed the attackers, and harassed the enemy through each French commune. The German General Staff became spooked that too large of a gap was opening up between its lines that the Allies would exploit. The Germans quickly abandoned their original Schlieffen Plan and did not keep the right hook strong to wrap around Paris. Upwards of a third of the planned divisions were removed from the German right flank and reassigned to the center and left. Thus, the Western Front started to look just like so many of the other past conflicts between Germany and France, with the two great forces simply crashing into each other near their shared border. This is exactly what Alfred von Schlieffen wanted to avoid, but now it had become the reality. The speed and success of the German advance was now catching up with their frontline troops. German soldiers were absolutely exhausted. As soon as a halt in the march was called, they collapsed in the road and fell asleep. Others seemed to sleep while they marched. Rations were thin. Ammunition was low at the front, where it was needed most. Supplies simply could not keep up with the pace. The lines were too long. Moreover, with their backs nearly to Paris and determined to not let it fall into the hands of the Germans like it had in 1871, British and French resolve stiffened. The Allies were getting closer to their supplies, while the opposite was happening to the Germans. It was at this desperate moment that Allied resolve became resolute, and the British and French were determined to retreat no longer and stop the Germans short of Paris. It was also at this moment that General Ferdinand Foch, general of the French Ninth Army, possibly uttered the famous words, "My center is yielding, my right is retreating, situation excellent, I am attacking." Foch probably never wired the words, but the statement nevertheless stands as a symbol of French determination to dig in and yield no further ground. Foch's words and the stand near the Marne River would make him a national hero and a pivotal figure for the remaining years of the war. It was also at this desperate moment, when the Germans were closing in on Paris, that one of the more famous events occurred in World War I. With the desperate need for soldiers at the front lines to prevent a German envelopment of Paris, all resources were mustered by the city, including the Paris taxis. At the beginning of the war, Paris had about 10,000 taxis, but with so many young men sent to the front, only 3,000 taxis were in service in Paris at the end of 1914, mostly driven by older men. As reserve French troops arrived in Paris from all over France, they needed to be transported the remaining 40 miles to the east of Paris to help with the fighting. Hundreds of taxis from Paris were therefore requisitioned and carried soldiers to the front lines. 4 soldiers could sit in the back and 1 up front next to the driver. They traveled at night on September 6th through the 7th and only kept their backlights on. The drivers were instructed to follow the backlights of the taxi in front of them. When they reached the front, the soldiers were dropped off, and then the drivers raced back to Paris to drive even more soldiers to the front. The Paris taxi drivers delivered over 4,000 desperately needed French troops to the lines and helped shore up the army for the defense of Paris. Some taxi drivers continued to travel to the front in the days ahead to bring supplies or to evacuate the wounded. The French government would later reimburse the drivers for their contribution to the war effort. While the Marne taxis only made a token contribution to troop strength at the front, their story carried enormous weight to bolster French morale amidst a desperate hour for the nation. After 2 solid weeks of retreating, Joffre finally gave the order to Allied troops to stop their retreat, turn, and attack. The French dug in on the right of the Allied front, and Joffre pleaded with and convinced General John French and the BEF to take a stand on the left of the Allied front. The reconstituted Allied armies that dug in at the Marne River Valley numbered almost 1 million men. The approaching Germans were approximately 750,000. Both sides held an equivalent number of 3,000 guns each. The stand of British and French troops near and around the Marne River became the most consequential engagement between the two sides of the war thus far. So significant would the First Battle of the Marne become, and so revered was its importance, that it would become known as the Miracle on the Marne, the long-awaited stop of the invading German forces. Despite the fact that French General Charles Lanrezac had been right about the German wing moving through Belgium and right that Joffre's endless offensives would result in disaster, Joffre dismissed him on September 3rd and replaced him with General Louis Franchet d'Espèrey. So desperate was the military situation in early September that on September 3rd, the French government fled Paris, fearing a German conquest of Paris. On September 5th, Joffre ordered a halt for all retreating Allied forces and to turn and attack in a great counteroffensive the next day, September 6th. The counteroffensive that the British and French finally launched on September 6th witnessed almost 1 million Allied troops fighting back against 750,000 German troops. The exhausted German troops simply could not stand the assaults of the regrouped Allied lines. They were too short on food, ammunition, and most of all, rest. German units that had crossed the Marne were pushed back onto the other side. The Battle of the Marne from September 5th to the 12th resulted in an estimated 250,000 French casualties, 12,700 British casualties, and almost 300,000 German casualties. German commanders wisely ordered a strategic withdrawal and to fall back and regroup. The Allies pursued the now retreating Germans along the same roads they had marched just a few days earlier. The change in direction for the Allies was dramatic, but nevertheless slow. Exhausted Allied forces averaged only 12 miles per day. The Germans continued to fall back. They had lost 15,000 prisoners, 30 field guns, and 100 machine guns to the Allies during the Battle of the Marne. The German retreat from September 9th to the 13th marked the end and failure of the Schlieffen Plan. General Moltke is said to have reported to the Kaiser, quote, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war," unquote. The war would grind on for 4 more murderous years, but there would be no quick victory for Germany in the West, and Paris would remain in French hands. The Germans finally ceased their retreat after 40 miles and then began to dig into the high ground overlooking the Aisne River Valley. When the Germans finally stopped their retreat, they selected some of the most formidable terrain on which to dig in and entrench. A broad farmland extended from the banks of the Aisne River and then quickly ascended several hundred feet with sharp hills that leveled out onto a broad plain. The Germans dug into the front side of the slopes and commanded the approaching low ground with their artillery and fixed machine guns. Quickly, the Germans dug 3 layers of trenches and converted the natural high ground into a veritable fortress. The Allies were simply too exhausted to drive the Germans off the terrain above the Aisne River. As a result, the German trenches in the area would only become deeper, more fortified, and more impregnable in the months and years to come. Failing to dislodge the Germans from the high ground surrounding the Aisne, the Allies endeavored to outflank the German position by moving north. The British and French moved north to get around the Germans, but the Germans blocked their flanking attack and moved north as well. Then the British endeavored to move further north to get around the Germans, but the Germans moved north as well. Next, the British tried to move even further north to turn the German flank, but were once again blocked by the Germans. The multiple attempts of each side to turn the northern flank of the opponent became known as the Race to the Sea. The flanking and counterflanking maneuvers did not stop until both sides reached the beaches of Newport, Belgium, and the North Sea. At last, there was no further ground to trench. Simultaneously, the French had tried and failed to outflank the Germans south of the Marne battlefield all the way to the Swiss border. There, the Western Front would pretty much remain until the very end of the war, the British manning most of the trenches in the north, and the French defending the trenches to the south. The Germans were dug in from the north to the south in a defensive position. Thus, by the fall of 1914, virtually a continuous trench line ran from the North Sea all the way to the border of Switzerland, a continuous trench line of 400 miles. The First World War on the Western Front would not be a war of movement. It would be a stalemate, an attrition for the next 4 years, with both armies having few victories to celebrate. Despite massive offensives, the trench line would barely move a few miles over the next several years. A hideous scar or ugly gash marring the European landscape that would remain for the rest of the war and become the place of death for millions and millions of soldiers during the First World War.